Jacinda Ardern addressed the China Business Summit in Auckland yesterday, revealing that a few plans are afoot for New Zealand ministers to return or visit China. Some commentators sensed or picked up a softer tone from the Prime Minister towards the other superpower, China, perhaps attempting to smooth over tensions caused by her comments about grave concerns with China that she made in association with American President Joe Biden earlier this year. And as we've discussed here on the platform, the geopolitics of our part of the world are heating up as we are on the kind of borderlands between an ever stronger, it would seem, or expansionist China and America trying to get its mojo back as the leading superpower in the world. Well, joining us now on the line for some views on these events is Geoffrey Miller. Jeff's with the Democracy Project. He's a regular contributor of excellent comments to the platform opinion pages as well. Geoffrey, nice to have you back, mate. How are you this morning?
Good morning, Sean. I'm very well.
All right. I'm trying to figure out where New Zealand stands geopolitically, because this seems to be another tack or another jibe when I thought we'd kind of decided, surprisingly to me, that we're hooray for the USA. Now it seems, we don't want to upset the Chinese too much.
Yes, Sean, there's always a bit of zigzagging with New Zealand foreign policy, and I think the government is aware that New Zealand needs China. A third of our exports go there. But at the same time, look, the climate has really shifted this year. So I think we did shift our foreign policy this year to be more pro-Western. I think that still largely stands. Sentiment towards China has just gone hugely negative throughout the West, including in New Zealand. 58% of New Zealanders see China as a threat now, according to the latest survey data from the Asia New Zealand Foundation that came out in June. So, I think things have changed. At the same time, there's always room for a bit of nuance, and perhaps the further we get from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the more room there is for a bit of nuance. And that seems to be what's behind this speech yesterday, and also a couple of other recent speeches that Jacinda Ardern has given in London and in Sydney.
The Chinese have also put some pressure on. You look at comments that are coming out of Beijing and diplomats here. They are paying attention to our change in attitude, aren't they? And they're subtly saying we don't like it.
Oh, they most certainly are, Sean. If you look at what the China said after New Zealand issued the joint statement with the US when Jacinda Ardern was in Washington meeting Biden in the White House, they were furious at that joint statement. But also, there were other statements that came out. The Chinese ambassador in Wellington paid a visit to Nanaia Mahuta after that joint statement at the end of May and made clear that China was not really happy. And one thing that China is often called for in these rebukes is for New Zealand to remember its independent foreign policy. So Jacinda Ardern has actually been at pains to emphasise this independent foreign policy line. She used that yesterday, and she also used that a lot of times in the speech in Sydney that she gave at the start of July. So I think she's trying to recalibrate a little bit and at least provide some level of nuance. But in the end, it is just words. I think you've actually got to see actions behind it. And I think we're still on the Western side this year in terms of the actions that have been taken. If you look at the sanctions that New Zealand put on Russia, that was a huge precedent for New Zealand to set. New Zealand's also signed up to the US's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's partners in the Blue Pacific, this new alliance with Japan and the UK and Australia. So, I think there have been real shifts this year.
All right. The forum is over now. Did we make any progress? Was the forum successful in, if you like, limiting or checking the expansion of China?
In some ways, the forum was a bit underwhelming in the end. It felt like we were going to get some big counter-offer. In the end, the US did offer a reasonable amount of extra money, $600 million over about 10 years to the Pacific. But it wasn't a super large amount. I guess the biggest takeaway for me from the Pacific Islands Forum was the fact that the US Vice President Kamala Harris was invited to address the summit by video. And China was not. In fact, they've made a decision to exclude what they call dialogue partners of the forum, which include countries like China, the US, the UK, India, and so forth. They had made a decision to exclude those dialogue partners from the week, but then at the last minute, Kamala Harris was invited to address the forum, which seemed to undermine the whole idea that this was just the Pacific talking about the Pacific amongst themselves. That had been the line that Australia and New Zealand had really put forward for weeks leading up to that summit, that this was all about the Pacific family. This was a regional summit. This did not involve the great powers. Well, in the end, it did. And Kamala Harris came in. And I find it hard to believe that that wouldn't have happened without the approval of Australia and New Zealand, although the invitation came from Fiji, which was the host, and came from Frank Bainimarama. I'm sure it was all coordinated.
Geoffrey, I know that Helen Clark says she now believes that Jacinda Ardern has set the record straight with China. In real terms, though, if China isn't happy with our attitude, or feels we are still talking out of both sides of our mouths or are not genuine about our friendship with China, what could China potentially do to damage or exert pressure on New Zealand? Hypothetically, what do bad relations with China look like?
Well, I think you only need to look to Australia to see what bad relations can look like. And Australia was heavily punished, particularly in relation to its barley, its beef exports, its wine exports. If you remember those punitive tariffs that were placed on those exports that Australia has back in the latter part of 2020. So it all but extinguished Australian wine exports to China, for example. Now, if we saw something similar happen to New Zealand's primary products, our milk powder, for example, it would be catastrophic for the New Zealand economy because we're just so dependent on the Chinese market. I guess the big difference between Australia and New Zealand is that Australia also has its minerals exports, its iron ore, effectively, and it's a much larger share of its exports to China than its primary products. And that gives actually Australia a useful leverage and a useful bargaining chip.
They got a buffer.
Yeah, well, China needs that material, those minerals, for its industrial base. And for Australia, the primary products are kind of the icing on the cake in terms of the exports to China. Whereas for New Zealand, our primary exports are basically the cake. It's most of what we export to China. So if China did penalise us on those primary products, we would be in big trouble.
Mm. So do you think we've got it about right? We're sitting pretty now, but we have to be careful not to let things get out of balance?
Yeah, well, the theme of the conference yesterday was a balancing act, and that phrase is often used to refer to the relationship. I think Jacinda Ardern is always acutely aware of public opinion, and she'll be well aware that public sentiment has gone heavily negative against China. So she's wanting to respond to that. And there was immense pressure to join the Western coalition against Russia earlier in the year. And then, the whole China story sort of fed into that, came off the back of that. Remember, China, was making a big play for the Pacific. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was making a tour of the Pacific. You had that security deal with the Solomons earlier in the year that China signed. And so it all kind of fed into this one big story. And Jacinda Ardern was just trying to respond week to week to all of this. I think we're seeing now, 6 months on, things have quietened down a little bit, and we're starting to see slight recalibration, and perhaps there is some slightly clearer air to do this. Although when I say that, I look at the news headlines today about Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Things are continuing to heat up more generally.
Yeah. Look, you mentioned Ukraine earlier, and if you don't mind us pivoting just for a moment there, what is China's attitude to Ukraine, and how important globally as to what is happening there is China's attitude?
Well, if you go back to the start of the war, a lot of commentators focused on that meeting that Xi Jinping had with Vladimir Putin in China at the Winter Olympics, and pointed to the strategic partnership, this alliance. I think the word was partnership with no limits. And, they thought that China would really help out Russia, militarily, perhaps, economically, certainly. I think things, 6 months on, are a bit more nuanced than that. We haven't seen a whole lot of military support coming from China to Russia. We haven't seen any, really. We've seen some economic support in some sense, but it's actually just been almost by default. The fact that the West is basically blacklisted Russia's oil exports meant that inevitably more Russian oil has gone to countries like China, but it's also gone to countries like India. India is buying an awful lot of Russian oil now, and they're supposedly, in some ways part of this broader Western coalition. India is a member of the Quad Alliance, for example, with Australia and the US and Japan against China. So, China's not the only one benefiting, in a sense, from the fact that Russia's been excluded, and Russian exports, Russian oil in particular, is being sold at a discount. So China's benefiting from that. But I don't think you're seeing a huge amount of direct cooperation between China and Russia. I think China, for the most part, is content to sit back and watch Russia fight its war with Ukraine. Russia's not really asking for lots of help, and China's not really providing it.
Is that Ukraine-Russia conflict still, if you like, driving international relations? And it's funny, isn't it? News cycles, it's not the big story it once was here. It doesn't get the sort of coverage here that it once did. But is it still the trigger point, the most important thing happening internationally?
I think so. I think there's just such a before and after, really, before February 24th and afterwards, and it really did bring quite a paradigm shift. I think when you're seeing a lot of the talk about Taiwan, a lot of that is stemming from what happened in Ukraine. I think a lot of commentators sort of changed their views and became a lot more hawkish over what happened in Ukraine. So they see an invasion of Taiwan by China as much more likely because of what Russia did to Ukraine. And look, there are some superficial similarities. China sees Taiwan as an integral part of China, and Russia sees Ukraine as part of Russia. So there are some similarities on the surface, but I think the reality is much more complex than that. And Xi Jinping, if you're looking at China, he's got a lot of interest in stability at the moment. That explains the whole zero COVID policy and so forth. He wants stability this year of all years because he's trying to get re-elected at the 20th Communist Party Congress in November, which would effectively make him leader for life. Now, look, things always can change, and people didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine either. But I think an invasion of Taiwan is really not imminent. And if anything, the provocation at the moment is coming really from the American side, given that you've got Nancy Pelosi, who's third in line to be president, visiting Taiwan. We'll wait and see what happens this week, but things could get quite bad again.
Okay, and meantime, little old New Zealand, we just try and stay friends with everyone.
Well, that was always the New Zealand strategy, and that's why Helen Clark is pleased, I think, with this some recalibration, was to just try and get on with everybody, keep our heads down, keep selling the milk powder, and just try and get on. Because it is a jungle out there, and the great powers are really at loggerheads at the moment. And New Zealand over the last 6 months has kind of been dragged into the western side, and we're trying to just as I say, recalibrate a little bit at the moment. That's my reading of what Jacinda Ardern's doing.
Geoffrey, always good talking to you. Your latest column is up on the platform. Geoffrey Miller there, I'd say our resident expert on geopolitical happenings and diplomacy. Thank you very much indeed.